There are moments when a family doesn't fall apart in a dramatic explosion. Instead, it fractures in silence, hairline cracks spreading quietly beneath the surface until one sentence, spoken at the wrong time, finally splits everything open. This story begins long before the internet noticed, long before comment sections picked sides, and long before a private family tension turned into a public reckoning. At the center of it all is a family already accustomed to living in the spotlight, where privacy is fragile and truth is often negotiated rather than declared. When the Braxton family's internal conflicts spill outward, they don't land softly. They echoed. It started with concern, or at least that's how it appeared. Ashley, a niece deeply loved within the family, began posting videos online raw, emotional, and unsettling. In those clips, she spoke openly about her experiences and made allegations involving her own family. The tone wasn't polished or calculated. It felt personal, heavy, and unresolved. And because it was posted publicly, it immediately invited interpretation. Within hours, the videos were circulating beyond their intended audience. Viewers dissected every word. Blogs summarized what they thought she meant. Strangers filled in emotional gaps with speculation. And just like that, something private became communal property. Inside the family, the reaction was not unified. Some saw a young woman in pain, finally speaking. Others saw a situation that needed protection, not amplification. That tension is important, because it explains everything that came next. When it was announced that Ashley would be interviewed on Tamar Braxton's podcast, the decision didn't feel neutral, it felt consequential. For some family members, it crossed an invisible line, one between offering support and putting a vulnerable situation on display. One voice in particular stood firm against it. Towanda Braxton, long viewed as the stabilizing presence within the family, reportedly believed the interview was a mistake. Her concern wasn't about silencing Ashley. It was about where and how the conversation would happen. In her view, the situation required containment, not expansion. Safety, not spectacle. Towanda wanted Ashley brought closer, not pushed further into public judgment. She wanted a controlled environment, one without microphones, algorithms, or audience expectations. And she made no apology for that position. Getting Ashley, she reportedly said, not as ownership, as protection. That moment matters because it reveals a core fault line. What does care look like when your family lives publicly? For Towanda, care meant quiet intervention. For Tamar, care meant openness. And those two definitions were never going to coexist peacefully. The unspoken history, by the time Ashley's situation unfolded online, the emotional groundwork inside the Braxton family had already been laid over. Years of unresolved tension. Outsiders often view explosive moments as sudden. In reality, they are usually the final chapter of a much longer story. Towanda Braxton's public image has always been carefully shaped not by branding teams. By behavior, she is often described as the responsible one, the mediator, the sister who absorbed pressure so others didn't have to. When conflict arose, Towanda leaned toward restraint rather than confrontation. That restraint became her signature. So when rumors periodically surfaced about her alleged ongoing involvement with Michael Braxton Jr., she didn't fight them publicly. She didn't deny them loudly. She didn't explain. She chose silence, believing that refusing to engage was a form of self-preservation. To Towanda, gossip starves when ignored. But families are not the internet. Inside families, silence doesn't kill. Rumors, it preserves them. And no one understood that better than Tamar Braxton. Tamar has never been known for her comfort with quiet ambiguity. She speaks emotionally, impulsively, and often from a place of frustration when she believes something is being misrepresented. Where Towanda values stability, Tamar values expression. Where one avoids the fire, the other confronts it directly. Their relationship has always carried that tension. Love exists there, so does resentment. So does exhaustion. They are sisters who have spent years navigating shared trauma, public scrutiny, and the weight of narratives that never quite tell the full story. That history matters because it explains why what happened next didn't feel accidental. the gray area. No. One wanted to name the alleged connection between Towanda and Michael. Braxton Jr. was never simple. Whatever existed between them, past or present, was shaped by family expectations, complicated emotions, and the pressure of being watched. Ending something like that is rarely clean. Relationships don't always end with a door slam. Sometimes, they fade unevenly. Distance on the surface can coexist with emotional attachment underneath. That gray area where nothing is officially happening, but nothing feels resolved, is fertile ground for rumor for years. Tamar reportedly watched that gray area persist. And from her perspective, the silence surrounding it didn't feel protective. It felt misleading, not just to the public, but to the family itself. Sources suggest Tamar believed that pretending something was over, if it wasn't, created confusion and mistrust. To her, honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was preferable to quiet denial. But honesty without consent is rarely received as truth. It's often experienced as betrayal. That distinction would soon become everything. When the silence broke, according to widespread online chatter, the moment that shifted everything came when Tamar Braxton allegedly spoke openly about Towanda's continued involvement with Michael Braxton Jr., not privately, but in a space where the words would travel. This wasn't whispered. It wasn't framed as speculation. It was presented as something Tamar believed to be true, and that certainty changed the atmosphere instantly. Because when a claim comes from inside the family, it carries a different weight. Tamar wasn't an outsider repeating gossip. She was a sister speaking from proximity. And when alleged truth comes from inside the circle, it cuts deeper. Insiders describe Towanda's reaction as immediate and intense rage, layered with betrayal. Not because the rumor itself was new, but because it had been spoken aloud, publicly, without warning. For years, Towanda's silence had been interpreted as dignity. In that moment, it became vulnerability. What made the situation explosive wasn't just what was said, it was who said it, where. Because once something is spoken publicly, it no longer belongs to the people involved. It belongs to the audience. Why this was never just about a relationship. To understand the scale of Towanda's anger, you have to understand what was truly taken from her in that moment. It wasn't just privacy, it was authorship. For years, she had chosen restraint. She had decided when not to speak. That silence was a form of control over her image, her boundaries, and her narrative. Tamar's alleged exposure didn't just reveal information, it removed that control. For someone who had spent years managing chaos quietly, being exposed publicly felt less like honesty and more like punishment for staying composed. And this is where the conflict deepened beyond facts. The argument stopped being about whether the claim was accurate. It became about who had the right to tell the story. Family dynamics make everything heavier. Sisters know where the wounds are. They know which truths hurt the most. When Tamar spoke, she wasn't just sharing information. She was reopening old injuries everyone had. Learned to step around carefully. That's why the tension escalated so fast. This wasn't a new conflict. It was an old one finally dragged into the open. Years of unspoken frustration, unresolved emotions, and opposing ideas about honesty collided in a single moment. And once family secrets surface publicly, they don't arrive alone. They bring history with them. This was the moment where silence stopped being an option. And with that, the stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone involved, sisters, relatives, and the audience watching from afar, to choose between loyalty and fallout. The moment Tamar's words entered the public space, the conflict stopped being theoretical. It stopped being emotional subtext. It became confrontation, according to online discussion and those familiar with the family dynamic. Tamar Braxton did not soften what she said. There were no disclaimers, no hedging language, no attempt to frame the claim as rumor or secondhand belief. It was delivered plainly, in a way that suggested certainty. That detail mattered, because certainty transforms tension into threat. To observers, it didn't sound like a sister venting frustration. It sounded like an accusation. One spoken in a place where Tamar knew it would travel, multiply, and harden before anyone involved had time to respond. For Towanda Braxton, the moment reportedly felt like an ambush. Insiders described her reaction as immediate and explosive, not because the subject itself was unfamiliar, but because years of careful restraint were undone in seconds. Silence, which had once shielded her, was suddenly weaponized against her. In public perception, silence stopped meaning dignity, started meaning confirmation. That shift is brutal, and it happens fast. The power of implication. What intensified the situation further was how the alleged involvement with Michael Braxton Jr. was framed. It wasn't described as a past misunderstanding or unresolved emotional residue. It was framed as ongoing. Ongoing implies choice. It implies continuity. It implies intention. And once a pattern is implied, it becomes incredibly difficult to dismantle. For Towanda, that framing struck at the core of her self-presentation. For years, she had been viewed as composed, private, and responsible. An ongoing situation contradicted that image. It recast restraint as concealment, almost immediately. The audience fractured. One side argued Tamar had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed during private matters, not out of necessity, but for impact. To them, it felt like leverage disguised as honesty. The other side insisted that truth shouldn't be conditional, that silence enables confusion, that discomfort doesn't justify denial. The internet did what it always does. It turned complexity into camps. Privacy versus transparency. Loyalty versus honesty. And in the middle of it all stood Towanda, watching a narrative form around her without her participation. The first major twist. This may not have been impulsive as the debate raged. Something unexpected began to surface. People familiar with Tamar's communication style noticed something unsettling. This didn't sound impulsive. It didn't feel like a slip born of emotion. It felt intentional, according to those close to the situation. Tamar's decision to speak may not have been driven by anger alone. It may have been driven by timing. The theory that began circulating quietly was this: Tamar may have believed that someone else was preparing to shape the story first. In that framing, her move wasn't about humiliation. It was about preemption. If Tamar believed the information was going to surface regardless through another interview, another leak, another narrative, then speaking first became a strategy. Not betrayal, but positioning. That reframing changed everything. Because in families that live publicly, timing is power. The first version of a story often becomes the definitive one. Corrections rarely travel as far as initial claims. Even denials struggle to escape the shadow of first exposure. If Tamar believed control of the narrative was slipping away, speaking first may have felt necessary. In that light, the exposure wasn't reckless, it was defensive. That possibility added a new layer to Towanda's reaction. Her fury, described by insiders as intense and destabilizing, may not have been fueled by embarrassment alone. It may have been driven by panic, the panic of losing authorship over her own life. Once a version of the story exists publicly, you are no longer correcting facts. You are reacting to perception. Silence, as a battleground as attention intensified. Michael Braxton Jr.'s silence became the loudest presence in the room. There was no immediate clarification, no denial, no confirmation, and silence, in moments like this, is never neutral. Some interpreted it as respect for family boundaries. Others saw it as avoidance. Neither interpretation relied on evidence. They relied on expectation. And expectation is a powerful accelerant. With no anchor to steady the narrative, speculation expanded freely. People projected their own assumptions onto the void. Old interactions were revisited. Past photos were reinterpreted. Intro moments were retrofitted with meaning. Behind the scenes, communication reportedly deteriorated rapidly. Messages went unanswered. Conversations stalled. Attempts at clarification dissolved into frustration. Family members found themselves quietly pressured to choose sides, not because they wanted to, but because neutrality became impossible. Even silence began to look like allegiance. By this stage, the conflict had evolved. It was no longer about whether an alleged relationship existed. It was about who gets to speak when they get to speak, what it costs when they do. Tamar's words shifted the balance of power. Towanda's anger exposed the cost of losing narrative control. Michael Jr.'s silence became a canvas for projection, and the most unsettling realization of all began to take shape. The exposure was a move. The shocking twist wasn't proof. It wasn't denial. It was the realization that this moment may have been strategic. Once that idea took hold, the entire conflict looked different. Not cleaner, not kinder, but clearer. If this was a move, then there was no going back to silence. Moves demand counter-moves. Silence becomes a statement, and restraint becomes vulnerability, with emotions raw and positions hardening. The story was primed to escalate beyond family control. Outside voices were already stepping in. Old resentments were resurfacing. The audience was no longer observing, they were participating. The question was no longer what happened. It was what happens next. Because once private truths collide with public platforms, the fallout doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves, and the next wave was already forming. The escalation didn't arrive with a single argument or explosive interview. It arrived in fragments, screenshots, reaction clips. Speculation framed as certainty. Once Tamar's alleged statement entered public circulation, the story escaped the family entirely. Blogs didn't wait for clarification. Commentators didn't pause for context. The language shifted quickly from allegedly to everyone already knew. And with that shift, restraint vanished. The internet doesn't escalate slowly, it accelerates. Each retelling shaved off nuance. Each reaction added conviction. What began as a claim turned into assumed fact through repetition alone. And repetition, when loud enough, becomes belief. For Towanda Braxton's phase was the most suffocating. Insiders described her emotional state as layered and volatile, not just anger at Tamar, but frustration at the machine now feeding on her silence. Every hour without a statement felt like another brick added to a wall closing in around her. Speak and fuel the story. Stay quiet and let it harden. There was no safe move, left silence. Becomes evidence in the public imagination. Silence is rarely interpreted as complexity. It's interpreted as guilt, avoidance, or strategy ever uncertainty. Towanda's restraint, once admired, began to work against her. Commentators questioned why she hadn't shut the rumor down decisively. Fans speculated that silence meant confirmation. Even those sympathetic struggled to defend her without sounding like they were. Justifying secrecy, silence stopped being neutral. It became narrative material, and the longer it lasted, the louder it spoke. At the same time, Tamar Braxton faced a backlash of her own. Supporters initially praised her for keeping it real, but the tone shifted as the consequences became clear. What Tamar may have intended as honesty was now being framed as cruelty. Critics accused her of exploiting family pain for attention, of turning private wounds into public spectacle. The internet doesn't weigh intent, it tallies impact. Suddenly, Tamar found herself in a defensive posture she hadn't anticipated. Her words were no longer hers to explain. They were being used, reshaped, weaponized by people who had no stake in the aftermath. Michael Jr.'s silence grows louder as the sisters absorb the pressure. Attention shifted fully to Michael Braxton Jr. His continued silence became the most analyzed element of the story, with no statement to anchor the narrative. Speculation filled the vacuum aggressively. Old photos were re-examined. Past interactions were replayed with new assumptions layered on top. Innocuous moments were reframed as clues. In the absence of facts, imagination took the lead, some interpreted Michael Jr.'s silence as dignitized an attempt to avoid pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. Others saw it as avoidance even, complicity. Neither interpretation relied on evidence, it relied on projection, and projection thrives in uncertainty. This is where the story took its second, major turn, the second twist. This wasn't about secrecy, it was about protection. People, while close to the family, began quietly suggesting something that reframed the entire escalation. The real issue, he said, was never whether the alleged relationship continued. It was why. The truth, whatever it was, had been treated as scandal instead of context. According to this perspective, silence wasn't about hiding wrongdoing. It was about protection. Protection of children. Protection of mental health. Protection of a fragile family equilibrium that had already endured years of public strain. From that angle, Towanda's anger wasn't rooted in embarrassment. It was rooted in breach, a breach of an unspoken agreement to keep certain matters private, not because they were shameful, but because exposure would cause more harm than clarity. If such a pact existed, breaking it publicly felt like betrayal, regardless of accuracy. This interpretation shifted the moral terrain. Suddenly, the debate wasn't truth versus lies. It was trust versus disclosure. Some who had initially backed Tamar began to reconsider. They argued that being right doesn't excuse being reckless, that truth delivered without consent can still be damaging. Others doubled down, insisting that silence only protects deception and that discomfort doesn't justify omission. The divide hardened into principle. Each side felt morally justified. Neither side was listening anymore. When mediation fails behind the scenes, the emotional cost. Mounted family conversations reportedly stalled. Attempts at mediation went nowhere. Every discussion looped back to the same unresolved question: who decides what stays private when your life is public? There was no consensus, only fatigue. This kind of exhaustion doesn't come from one argument. It comes from defending yourself against a story that keeps repeating without evolving. From watching your intentions be flattened into talking points. From realizing that even a perfectly worded statement might not change anything. Observers began noticing something uncomfortable. Even if the claim were denied tomorrow, the damage was already done. Public exposure had redrawn boundaries permanently. Trust, once cracked, doesn't reseal IZEAL, especially when the fracture happens under public scrutiny. The escalation had reached a point of no return. It was no longer about resolving facts. It was about managing fallout. And the fallout was already moving faster than anyone inside the family could contain. By the time the story reached this stage, the energy had changed. The shock was gone. The outrage had cooled. What remained was something heavier. This was no longer a viral moment. It was a fracture. What began as an alleged exposure had evolved into a public reckoning that no single person could control anymore. The internet had already assigned roles, and those roles were hardening into identity. For Towanda Braxton, the fallout was isolating. Insiders described her as feeling cornered, not only by Tamar's words, but by the speed at which the public accepted them. The narrative didn't wait for confirmation. It moved forward on assumption alone. Anger, once outward, turned inward. Friends noticed withdrawal, less engagement, fewer responses, a visible pullback from spaces where she had once felt steady. The reputation she had spent years building, come private, responsible, felt suddenly rewritten by a storyline she never agreed to tell. Even supporters struggled. Defending her without sounding like they were excusing secrecy became nearly impossible. Silence no longer looked dignified. It looked strategic. And in the court of public opinion, strategy often reads as guilt. Towanda wasn't just losing control of the story. She was losing the ability to be seen as she had been. Tamar's cost. Tamar Braxton faced a different kind of fallout, but no less heavy. While some fans continued to praise her for speaking openly, the tone shifted sharply. Critics accused her of cruelty, opportunism, and emotional recklessness. What Tamar may have believed was necessary. Honesty was now framed as deliberate harm, sources say. Tamar felt misunderstood. From her perspective, she hadn't spoken to destroy anyone. She had spoken to disrupt what she believed was ongoing deception. But intent didn't soften impact. The more she explained, the more defensive she appeared. And defense, online, is often treated as admission. The familiar position, returned Tamar. Found herself once again both applauded and condemned, celebrated. For authenticity by some, accused of exploitation by others. The duality wasn't new, but this time it cut closer. This wasn't a celebrity feud. This was family. And family conflicts don't end when the comments stop refreshing. Michael Jr. becomes the center. Without speaking then, there was Michael Braxton. JR, his silence, once interpreted generously, grew heavier with each passing day. The public fallout wrapped around him like fog. Without a statement, every past interaction with Towanda was re-examined. Neutral moments were no longer neutral, were clues in the public imagination. Absence becomes meaning. Some viewed his silence as restraint, a refusal to add chaos to an already volatile situation. Others interpreted it as avoidance, even confirmation. Neither side needed evidence. The narrative had moved beyond it, and once a story reaches that point, facts struggle to regain authority. A family divided quietly inside the family. The damage wasn't loud. It was exhausting. Loyalists split. Some relatives reportedly pushed for reconciliation, urging restraint, and private resolution. Others believed the line had already been crossed, that once something is said publicly, it can't be taken back privately. Every conversation carried weight. Every silence felt loaded. This wasn't a dramatic family blow-up. It was something slower and more corrosive. The kind of fracture that doesn't announce itself, but reshapes relationships quietly. Even the audience began to shift. Comment sections, once fueled by outrage, grew uneasy. Viewers who had initially leaned into the drama began questioning their own participation. The tone changed from excitement to discomfort. Was this still entertainment? Or had it crossed into intrusion? The moment curiosity turns into unease is the moment fallout becomes undeniable. The quiet realization, the most painful truth, didn't arrive with a headline. It arrived quietly. No one won. If truth existed, it was buried beneath reaction. Privacy was gone. Trust was cracked. And the family, already fragile, now had to navigate a public memory that wouldn't forget. Because public fallout isn't just about being talked about. It's about being redefined without consent. Once that happens, even silence feels like loss. By this stage, it became clear that no statement, no matter how carefully worded, could restore what had been taken. The damage wasn't about facts anymore. It was about exposure. And exposure doesn't rewind. The final twist didn't arrive as a confession. It didn't arrive as a denial. It arrived as a realization. As the noise reached its peak, people close to the family began quietly acknowledging something difficult to accept. The exposure may have ended more than it revealed. Not because it proved or disproved anything, but because it permanently altered how truth itself could exist inside the family. What once lived in private negotiation had been dragged into public judgment, and that shift cannot be undone. For Towanda Braxton, the story now sits in her silence, but not the kind of silence people assume. Insiders suggest it isn't guilt or avoidance. It's recalibration, a recognition that anything said publicly will live forever. Frozen in screenshots and headlines long after context fades, in a culture where correction never travels faster than accusation, restraint becomes survival. Silence for Towanda is no longer about keeping peace. It's about protecting what remains. For Tamar Braxton, the realization landed differently. Sources suggest she believes she finally said what needed to be said, that speaking her truth, however messy, was necessary. But the cost was heavier than expected. Speaking didn't bring relief, it brought distance. The cliffhanger for Tamar isn't whether the claim stands. It's whether honesty without consent can ever heal a family, or whether it only redraws boundaries permanently. And then there is Michael Braxton Jr., still silent, still central, still unresolved. His lack of public response keeps the story suspended. In midair, without his voice, the narrative can't close. Every possibility remains alive. Ambiguity lingers, and ambiguity is powerful. Here's the final, comfortable truth at this point. The facts may no longer matter as much as the breach. Once trust fractures publicly, even truth struggles to repair it. The exposure changed how. Stories will be told inside this family from now on. Who gets access? who gets silence, and who gets distance. The cliffhanger remains stark. Will Towanda ever reclaim her narrative, or will silence become her permanent boundary? Will Tamar regret speaking publicly, or stand by the belief that truth should never wait? And will Michael Jr. ever speak or allow ambiguity to define the aftermath? Because some revelations don't end stories, they change the rules of how stories are allowed to exist. And once the rules change, the next chapter doesn't need a headline to begin. It's already unfolding quiet, unresolved, and closer than anyone expects. This is where the story stops and where the conversation belongs. To you, what unfolded between Towanda Braxton, Tamar Braxton, and Michael Braxton Jr. isn't just family drama. It's a lesson in boundaries, consent, and the cost of telling someone else's story before they're ready. So ask yourself, if you knew something true but deeply personal, would you say it publicly? Does honesty justify exposure, especially when family is involved? Once trust is broken in public, can it ever be rebuilt in private? There are no simple answers. But how we discuss moments like this matters. Curiosity can turn into harm. Commentary can turn into consequence. And real people carry the weight long after the timeline refreshes. Share your thoughts, but keep it respectful. Debate the situation, not the individuals. These are real relationships navigating public pressure, not characters. Written for resolution. If you want more long-form breakdowns that center the people involved, unpack viral moments with care, and avoid chaos-driven narratives. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this chapter may be closing, but unresolved truths have a way of resurfacing when no one expects them.